I've never told this story properly. Not all of it. Bits of it, sure, to my wife, to a few old regulars who used to stop by my stand. But never the whole thing start to finish, the way it actually happened. I'm telling it now because I'm old. And because the man it's really about deserves to have somebody say his name out loud one more time. I'll change some of the names. You'll understand why. The girl in this story, I'll call her Charlotte, though that wasn't quite what they called her at the time. And the palace I won't name either, not exactly. Let's just say if you've ever stood at a tall black gate in central London with a camera in your hand, freezing your fingers off, waiting for a man in a red coat to so much as blink, you've stood near the place I mean. For 31 years I ran a little stand on the corner across from those gates. Flowers mostly, postcards, cold drinks in summer, hot tea in winter. I sold umbrellas to tourists who didn't believe me when I told them it'd rain, and then sold them a second one when the first blew inside out. So when I tell you I saw things, I mean it. I saw everything. You stand on one corner for 31 years, you stop being a person to people. You become part of the street, and people forget you can see them. That's how I know what I know. Let me set it for you, the way it was. It was autumn, October, maybe early November. The kind of London morning where the sky can't decide what it wants to be. Gray, then bright, then gray again. There was a wind coming up off the park that smelled like wet leaves and cold metal, and it cut right through your coat no matter how good the coat was. The tourists were thinner that time of year, but they were still there. They're always there. That morning I had a family from somewhere warm, Spain, I think, or Italy, and the little ones were red in the cheeks and bouncing on their toes, and the dad kept pointing at the guard and saying something I couldn't hear and laughing. People always laugh near the guards. It's nervous laughter mostly. You stand in front of a man who won't look at you, won't speak to you, won't move, and something about it gets under your skin. You poke at it. You make faces. You try to be the one who finally cracks him. Nobody ever cracks him. That's the whole point. I'd sold 3 coffees and a bunch of yellow roses by 8:30. The roses went to a young man who looked like he was about to propose and was going to be sick about it first. Good luck to him. And across the road on his post stood Daniel. I should tell you about Daniel. His full name doesn't matter for this. I called him Dan when I could get away with it, which wasn't often because you can't exactly chat with them when they're on duty. But over the years we'd got friendly in the small ways you do. A nod, a look. Once in a downpour so heavy the gutters turned into rivers, I'd run across with a cup of tea and set it on the little ledge by his sentry box without a word and walked back. And he never moved a muscle, but the next day when his shift ended and he came past my stand in his ordinary clothes, he stopped and he said, "That tea, yesterday, thank you." And that was the start of it. He was young, late 20s I'd guess when all this happened. Tall the way they all are, but there was something different about the way Daniel held himself. The other lads, they stood still because they had to. Daniel stood still like it was a thing he was good at. Like stillness was a craft and he decided to be the best at it. He had a face that gave nothing away on duty and gave everything away off it. When he wasn't in uniform, he smiled easy, talked about his mum, who lived up north, told me about a girl he was sweet on who worked in a bakery near his flat. Ordinary things. He was an ordinary lad who'd found himself doing an extraordinary job, and he took it more seriously than anyone I ever met. I asked him once why he did it. Why the army, why the guard, why the standing still in the rain? He thought about it for a long time, longer than the question seemed to need. Then he said, "Somebody has to keep watch. Might as well be somebody who actually cares whether the people inside are safe." I didn't think much of it at the time, just a nice thing for a young man to say. I think about it all the time now. Now the people inside. You hear all sorts when you run a stand by a palace. Half of it's nonsense. Tourists asking if the Queen's home, if they can get a tour, if the guards are real soldiers or just for show. They're real. Lord, they're real. But over the years, you also pick up the true stuff, the quiet stuff from the staff who'd come out for a smoke or a sandwich and stand near my stand because I was safe. I was furniture, remember? I didn't count as a person, and they'd talk. That's how I first heard about Charlotte. She wasn't the main family. I want to be clear about that. She was a cousin, a side branch, the kind of royal that exists but that you never really see. Important enough to live in the palace in a wing of it, but not important enough that anyone outside ever cared. The papers didn't follow her. The tourists didn't know her name. She was, by all accounts, almost invisible. The staff loved her, though. That's the thing I picked up first before anything else. The way they talked about her. There was a cook, a big woman with red hands who'd come out for her break, and she'd light up if Charlotte's name came up. "That girl," she'd say. "That girl's the only one in there worth a damn." She told me Charlotte learned every member of staff's name. Every one. The cleaners, the gardeners, the ones who emptied the bins. She knew their kids' names. She remembered birthdays. A footman told me Charlotte once gave up her own coat, a proper good coat, the kind that costs more than I made in a month, to a young maid who was shivering at a bus stop and just said, "Keep it. I've got others," and walked back in and never mentioned it again. So that's who she was. By all the talk I ever heard, she was kind in the way that costs you something. Not the easy kind of kind, the photograph kind. The real kind, the kind nobody's watching. And then about a year before all this, the talk changed. It changed slowly. That's how these things go. You don't notice the moment the air gets colder. You just notice one day that you're shivering. First it was that nobody saw her as much. The cook stopped mentioning her. When I asked, just making conversation, "How's the young lady, the kind one?" she went a bit funny and said, "Oh, she's not been well, I think, keeping to her rooms." And she changed the subject. Then the footman, the one who told me about the coat, he stopped coming round at all. Got moved to another posting, I heard. And the new lot of staff, the ones who replaced the old faces, they were different. Quieter. They didn't talk. They didn't stand near my stand and gossip. They smoked fast and looked over their shoulders and went back in. And there was a new man. I never knew his real name. The staff called him something I won't repeat, a nasty little nickname, but to his face it was Mr. Ashford, and that's what I'll call him. I saw him most mornings. He came in a black car, and the car would slow at the gates, and he'd get out and walk the last bit, and I always thought that was strange. Why get out early? Then I understood. He liked walking past the guards. He liked the moment of it, the way they had to stand for him. He'd straighten his coat and lift his chin and walk through like he was the most important man in England. He had a way of looking at people, like he was pricing them, like he was working out what you were worth and finding it wasn't much. The first time he looked at me like that, I felt it in my stomach. I'd been standing on that corner for nearly 30 years, and no one had ever made me feel small the way that man did in 2 seconds without a word. He looked at the guards the same way, like furniture, like me. But Daniel, and I noticed this, I want you to remember I noticed this early, Daniel watched him back. Not openly, you couldn't on duty, but I'd been reading that boy's face across a road for years by then, and I could see it. Every morning when Ashford walked through, Daniel's eyes would move, just slightly, just enough to track him, and there'd be something in the set of his jaw, some tiny tightening that wasn't there for anyone else. Daniel didn't like him. I didn't know why yet. I don't think Daniel fully knew why yet either, but the body knows things before the mind catches up. You meet someone and your skin crawls and you can't say why, and months later you find out exactly why, and you think, I felt that. I felt that from the start. That's how it was with Ashford. Now the locked door. I have to tell you about the locked door, because the whole thing turns on it, and I only know about it because of Daniel. There was a part of the palace in the wing where Charlotte lived that had a door the staff weren't allowed through anymore. This was new. It hadn't always been locked. The cook, back when she still talked to me, had mentioned it once in passing as just a room, a sitting room, a study, somewhere Charlotte used to spend her time. There was a window in it that looked out over the gardens, and Charlotte liked to sit there and read, the cook said, and you'd see her up there sometimes, a little figure in the glass. And then one day there was a lock on the door, and the window was covered, and nobody went up there, and nobody talked about it. Daniel told me this, not all at once, over weeks, in the little snatches we got when his shift ended and he'd come past in his civvies and we'd walk a bit together toward the tube, two ordinary men in the dark. He told me he'd started noticing things that didn't add up. The lights in that room. He could see the wing from his post at certain times, certain angles, and he said the light in that covered window, you could see it leak around the edges of whatever they'd put up. The light would go on at strange hours, 3 in the morning, 4, and go off again, like someone was awake up there who couldn't sleep, or someone who wasn't allowed to. The deliveries. He said food went up to that wing on a tray every day, carried by one of Ashford's people, not the regular kitchen staff, one of the new lot, and the tray that came back down was barely touched. And once, he said, just once, he'd heard something. He was on a night posting near that side, and the window was open a crack despite the cover, and the wind carried it down for half a second. Someone crying. Not loud, not hysterical, just quiet, tired crying, the kind a person does when they've done it so many times it's just a thing the body does now, like breathing. I thought I imagined it, he told me. We were standing under a streetlight and his breath was fogging and he looked younger than I'd ever seen him. I told myself I imagined it. We're not supposed to think about what's behind us. We face out. We keep watch on what's coming in. We don't, he stopped. He rubbed his face. We don't worry about what's already inside. But you did, I said. He looked at me. Yeah, he said, I did. I should have done more. I've had a lot of years to sit with that. I should have said something to someone, made some noise, asked some loud questions. But who do you tell? I was a flower seller. Daniel was a private, a guardsman, the lowest of the low in that whole machine. We had nothing. No proof. Nothing but a covered window and a quiet bit of crying and a feeling about a man in a black coat. You don't take that to anyone. They'd have laughed. Or worse, they'd have made sure Daniel never worked another day, and what good would he be to anyone then? So we did the thing people do. We told ourselves it wasn't our business. We told ourselves someone above us must know, must have it in hand, because surely, in a place like that, with all those important people, somebody must be looking after a young woman who was clearly not well. We told ourselves a lot of things. And all the while, that window went dark and bright at 3 in the morning, and the trays came down untouched, and Ashford walked through the gates with his chin up, and Daniel stood his post and faced out like he was trained to, and kept his thoughts behind his eyes. I want to tell you it built, and there was a sign, and we knew the storm was coming. It wasn't like that, it's never like that. That's the thing I learned. The terrible days come on ordinary mornings. They don't warn you. They walk up in plain clothes and stand next to you, and you don't even notice until they've already happened. The morning everything changed, started exactly like every other morning. I remember the roses. I'd got a good batch in white and red, proper full ones, and I was arranging them in the buckets when the first of the day's tourists came. A school group, French, all in matching caps, with 2 teachers trying and failing to keep them in a line. The kids ran straight for the gates to gawp at the guards, and the teachers chased them, and one of the caps blew off and rolled into the road, and a taxi swerved and honked, and everyone laughed, and it was loud and silly and alive, the way that corner always was in the morning. The sky was doing its thing. Gray, then a bit of sun, then gray. The wind was up. There was a smell of coffee from the cart down the way and exhaust from the road and the green smell of the park behind it all. Daniel was on his post. He'd given me the smallest nod when I'd come out, the one that meant I see you, I'm here, all's well. I'd nodded back. Ashford's car came at the usual time, slowed at the gate, and out he got and on he walked, chin up, coat straightened, past the guards, through, gone. And I remember, this is the bit I remember most clearly, clearer than anything. I remember thinking as he passed Daniel that something was different. Ashford was carrying a case, a document case, leather, the expensive kind. He always carried it, nothing strange there. But he was holding it wrong, clutched, tight against his body, both hands, and he was walking faster than usual, and he didn't do his little chin-up performance for the guards. He went past with his head down, fast, like a man who didn't want to be seen. And Daniel's eyes tracked him, all the way, further than usual. I felt it in my stomach again. That same small, cold feeling I'd felt the first time Ashford had looked at me. Something was wrong that morning. I knew it the way you know weather. I didn't know what. I didn't know it would be the worst day that street had ever seen, or that by the end of it everything I thought I understood about that quiet, still young man across the road would be turned completely upside down. I just knew, watching Ashford clutch that case and hurry through the gates with his head down, that the cold I'd been feeling for a year was about to become something I could see. I went back to my roses. It was by then about 10 minutes to 9. 40 minutes later, the world came apart. 40 minutes. I've thought about those 40 minutes more than I've thought about almost anything in my life, because they were nothing. They were the most ordinary 40 minutes you could imagine, and they were the last ordinary minutes that street ever had. I sold roses, 2 bunches, the red ones, to a woman in a hurry who didn't even slow down to take her change. I sold a coffee. I rearranged the postcards because the wind kept knocking them flat. A pigeon got into the bucket of white roses and I shooed it out and it left a feather behind and I picked the feather out and dropped it in the gutter. That's it, that's what I was doing. The French school group had moved on, off toward the park, the teachers herding them like sheepdogs. The proposal lad had gone too, off to be sick somewhere private I hoped, the yellow roses gone with him. The light was doing the bright gray thing. Daniel was on his post. And then there was a sound. People always ask when I get this far what it sounded like. And I never know how to answer because it didn't sound like anything I had a word for. It wasn't a bang, that's the strange thing. In the films it's a great crack, a boom, a thing you hear. This wasn't like that. This was lower than hearing. It came up through my feet before it reached my ears. The pavement jumped. The buckets rattled. The water in the rose buckets shivered into rings, all of them at once, every bucket like the whole street had been struck somewhere underneath. And then a half-second behind it the sound. A deep, ugly, flat whump off to the east over toward the park. Not sharp, heavy. The kind of sound a building makes, not a firework. And then silence. A horrible held-breath silence, maybe 2 seconds long, where the whole world seemed to stop and ask itself what it had just heard. And then the birds. Every pigeon, every starling, every bird on every ledge and roof and tree for half a mile went up at once. A great gray roar of wings. The sky filled with them. I'd never seen anything like it and I never have since. The birds knew before we did. They always do. And then the screaming started. I didn't move at first. I want to be honest with you. I'm not a brave man. I stood frozen behind my stand with a rose in my hand and I didn't move because my mind simply could not catch up with what my body already knew. It came from the direction of Hyde Park. The corner of it, the bottom end, where the road runs along and there's always people, joggers, dog walkers, the breakfast crowd cutting through. A column of something was going up over the rooftops. Not flame, not at first. Dust. A gray-brown column of dust and smoke, climbing, leaning in the wind, spreading out flat at the top the way they do. Later they'd tell us what it was. A device. Left in a bin or a bag near the road by the park gates. I'm not going to talk about how or what, because it doesn't matter and because some things you shouldn't put in a story for people to chew on. What matters is that it went off at 8 minutes to 10 on an ordinary morning in a place full of ordinary people, and it took some of them away, and it hurt a great many more. But I didn't know any of that yet. All I knew was the column of dust and the screaming and the birds. And then the street I knew turned into a thing I didn't. People came running. From the park toward us, toward the open road, that instinct people have to run toward the big solid building, toward anything that looks like safety. Some of them were hurt. I could see it even from across the road, the way they moved, the way some of them were holding their arms, their heads. One man came past my stand at a dead run with blood on the side of his face, and he didn't even see me. He just ran, and I'll never forget his eyes. They weren't seeing anything at all. A woman fell on the pavement just by my corner, just dropped. I don't think she was hurt. I think her legs just stopped working, the way they do. I came out from behind the stand finally, my own legs like water, and I got down to her and I said something. I don't know what, and she grabbed my sleeve and held on and didn't let go. The traffic stopped. Cars just stopped in the road, doors opening, people getting out, looking east at the column of dust with their hands over their mouths. And there was noise everywhere now. Sirens already far off, getting closer. Alarms going off in the buildings. People shouting names, calling for someone, a child, a wife, somebody they'd been with a minute ago and now couldn't see. That's the sound I hear in my sleep sometimes still. Not the blast. The names. All those people shouting names into the dust. In the middle of all of it, I looked across the road. And Daniel was still standing on his post. I have to make you understand what that looked like. The whole world was moving. Everyone, everything, all of it. A great churning panic of running and falling and shouting and cars and dust. The street was a river that had burst its banks. People were doing the most human thing there is, which is to run, to save themselves, to get away from the terrible thing. And in the middle of it, by the gate, in his red coat, perfectly still, was Daniel. He hadn't moved, not an inch. Rifle held the way it's always held, back straight, eyes forward. The dust was starting to drift down the road now, a thin gray fall of it settling on everything, on the cars, on the fallen leaves, on the shoulders of his coat, and he stood there and let it settle on him, and he did not move. I remember thinking he must be in shock. That's the only way my mind could make sense of it. He's frozen, I thought. The poor lad's frozen with fear. I know now that wasn't it, not even close. There were two of them on post that morning, Daniel and another lad, younger, newer. And I saw the younger one, I saw him break. I don't blame him. God knows I don't blame him. He was a boy and a bomb had gone off and his every instinct was screaming at him to run. And for a second, half a second, I saw him turn, saw his head whip toward the noise, saw his whole body lean to go. And Daniel said something to him. I couldn't hear it. Too far, too much noise. But I saw Daniel's head turn the smallest fraction toward the younger lad, and I saw his mouth move, just a few words, sharp and short, and I saw the younger lad freeze and then straighten, and then plant himself back on his post. Whatever Daniel said, it held him. It put steel back in a boy who'd been about to run, just words, just a few words from a man who would not move. Later I found out what guards are trained to do in a thing like that. They don't run. That's the whole of it. They hold their post unless they're ordered off it, because the thing they guard does not get to be left undefended just because the world is ending. If they ran every time something went wrong, they wouldn't be guards. They'd just be men in costumes. But knowing the training doesn't explain Daniel. Plenty of men know the training. Knowing it and standing in a falling cloud of dust while wounded people stream past you screaming, and not moving, not flinching, holding not just your own nerve but the nerve of the lad beside you, that's not training. That's something the training can only hope to find already in a man. The crowd reached him. That's the part nobody believes when I tell it, but I saw it with my own eyes. People panicking ran straight at the gates. Of course they did. A great tall solid wall, gates, a building behind, every animal instinct says get inside, get behind something thick. And they pressed up against those gates, fists on the iron, shaking it, screaming to be let in. And there was a moment, I held my breath through it, where it could have turned into a crush. where that panicking crowd could have surged and people could have gone down and been trampled, right there, 20 feet from where the woman was still gripping my sleeve. And Daniel moved. First time. The first time he'd moved since the blast. And he didn't move to run. He moved toward them, toward the crowd. He stepped off his exact post, and I learned later that even those few steps is a decision a guard isn't supposed to make lightly, and he put himself between the panicking crowd and the gate, and he raised one arm flat and he spoke. I heard him this time. The wind brought it. His voice wasn't loud exactly, but it was the kind of voice that goes through noise instead of over it. Low, hard, absolutely certain. Stand back, move along the wall to your left. There's room, children to the front, move along the wall, you're safe, just move. And the crowd, this is the thing, the crowd listened. In the middle of all that terror, here was one man who wasn't afraid, one man who knew exactly what to do and said it like there was no possibility of being disobeyed, and the panicking people grabbed onto that the way the fallen woman had grabbed onto my sleeve. They moved, along the wall, children to the front. The crush that was building just eased, drained off sideways along the railings into the space he'd told them was there. He stood there with his arm out, and he funneled a panicking mob into order with nothing but his voice, and the simple, unbelievable fact that he would not be afraid in front of them. I've thought about it so many times. If he runs, they all run, and they run into each other, and people die at that gate. He didn't run, so they didn't die. That's it, that's the whole arithmetic of it. One man decided not to be afraid, and other people lived. The next stretch is a blur, and I'll tell it as a blur because that's honest. The emergency lot arrived. Police first, then the ambulances, then more police, then men in heavy gear I didn't have names for. The road got cordoned. They started moving people back, away from the park, herding the wounded toward the ambulances and the unhurt toward the side streets. I got the fallen woman up and handed her to a paramedic, and she let go of my sleeve at last, and I had 4 little white marks on my wrist where her fingers had been. I went back to my stand because I didn't know what else to do. A man's whole life can be on fire and he'll still, somehow, drift back toward his own little corner of the world, because it's the only thing his hands know how to do. I stood behind my buckets of roses with dust settling on them, turning the red ones gray, and I watched the street I'd known for 31 years be taken over by people in uniforms. And across the road, the gates opened. Not for the crowd, that was long past. The crowd moved on. The gates opened from the inside and people came out. Staff, officials, the machine of the place spilling out to deal with the disaster on its doorstep. And in amongst them, moving fast, head down, came a man in a black coat clutching a leather case to his chest with both hands. Ashford. He came through the gate and he didn't go toward the wounded, didn't go toward the police, didn't stop to help a single soul. He went the other way, hurrying, down the side of the building, toward where the black cars waited, with that case held against him like a child he was carrying out of a fire. And as he passed the gate, as he passed Daniel, who had gone back to his post by then, dust gray from his shako to his boots, Daniel turned his head and looked at him. Full on, direct, off protocol, against everything. A guard simply turning and staring a man down. And I was watching Daniel's face, the way I'd watched it for years across that road, and I saw something move across it that I'd never seen there before. I'd seen Daniel calm, I'd seen him kind, I'd seen him just minutes before stand like a rock in a flood. I had never seen him look the way he looked at Ashford in that moment. It was a look that should have stopped a man's heart. Here's the bit that I didn't understand until later, but I'll put it where it belongs, so you feel it the way Daniel felt it. In all the chaos, the running, the crush, the funneling of the crowd along the wall, there had been a word going around. A panic on top of the panic. Among the staff who'd come spilling out, among the household, there was a question being shouted, the same kind of name shouting I'd heard from the crowd, but worse, sharper, because these were people who were supposed to know. Where is she? Where's the princess? Where's Charlotte? She wasn't in her rooms. The wing was locked. The door was locked, the way it had been locked for a year. And when the panic came and the household tried to account for everyone, the way you do, heads counted, names ticked off, there was a name they couldn't tick. She wasn't behind the locked door. Now think about what that meant. A bomb had gone off 8 minutes to 10 at the corner of Hyde Park, a place full of ordinary people walking, cutting through, on their way somewhere on an ordinary morning. And the young woman who was supposed to be locked away upstairs, the one the trays went up to untouched, the one whose light burned at 3 in the morning, the one nobody had properly seen in a year, she wasn't where she was meant to be. She was out, and nobody knew where. Daniel heard it the same time everyone heard it, standing on his post, gray with dust. Where's Charlotte? She's not in the wing. She's not anywhere. And then, 20 seconds later, Ashford came hurrying through that gate with his head down and his case clutched to his chest, running away from the disaster instead of toward the missing girl he was supposed to be responsible for. That's why Daniel looked at him like that. Because in that one moment, Daniel understood something. Not all of it, he didn't have it all yet, the proof was still in that leather case pressed against Ashford's coat, but he understood the shape of it. The covered window, the untouched trays, the crying at night, the locked door. A girl gone on the worst morning London had seen in years, and the man responsible for her sprinting away clutching a case full of God knows what. I saw Daniel's hands. They were perfectly still on the rifle, the way they're trained to be, but his knuckles had gone white, bone white, holding still so hard it cost him everything he had. He didn't move. He couldn't. He was on duty in the middle of the worst incident of his career, with the whole world watching and the police everywhere and orders coming down the line. A guard does not break his post. A guard does not chase a man down and slam him against a wall and tear a leather case out of his hands. So Daniel stood there, gray with dust, white at the knuckles, and he watched Ashford walk away free. For now, the shift ended eventually. They always do. They brought a relief detail, and once the area was secured and Daniel and the younger lad were stood down at last, hours passed when they should have been, and they went back through the gates, into the building, out of my sight. I didn't see Daniel again that day. But I saw him that night. Long after dark, long after the cordons and the news vans and the worst of it, when the street was finally quiet in a stunned, emptied-out way, I was still there. I hadn't been able to make myself go home. I'd been sweeping dust off my stand for an hour, the same patch of stand, over and over, because my hands needed something to do. And a figure came down the dark street toward me, out of uniform now, in his ordinary coat, and it was Daniel. He stopped at my stand, under the streetlight, and I looked at his face and I knew, before he said a word, that something inside him had changed and was not going to change back. He didn't look frightened. He didn't look like a man who'd survived a bomb. He looked like a man who had finally let himself feel a thing he'd been holding off for a year, and the thing was fury. But it was the quiet kind, the cold kind, the kind that doesn't shout because it's already decided what it's going to do. They've called it off for the night, he said. His voice was very level. Police have got the wing sealed. Said they'll deal with it tomorrow. Said she'll turn up. Said not to, he stopped and his jaw worked, not to speculate. And you, I said. He looked at me. The streetlight caught his eyes. I'm going back in, he said. Tonight. I know how to get up to that wing without going through the front. I've stood near it long enough. A pause. There's a door up there that's been locked for a year, and a girl who should be behind it and isn't, and a man who ran away from a bomb clutching a case to his chest like it was the only thing in the world that mattered. He set his jaw. I'm going to open that door. Now you have to understand, I wasn't there for the next part. I couldn't have been. I was a flower seller standing on a cold, dark street, and what happened that night happened inside walls I never set foot behind in my life. So how do I know it? Daniel told me. Not that night he just turned up his collar and walked off into the dark with that terrible calm in him. He told me afterward, over weeks, over months, the same way he'd told me everything in pieces on the walk to the tube, two ordinary men under streetlights. He made me promise to keep it quiet while it mattered. It doesn't matter anymore, not the way it did. So I'll tell it to you the way he told it to me. In his words, near enough, as best as an old man's memory can hold them. This is what happened behind the door. He got in the way he said he would. He'd stood near that building for years. He knew the staff entrances, the ways the cleaners went, the doors that were watched and the ones that weren't. On a normal night he'd never have got near that wing. But that wasn't a normal night. Half the household was gone, the police were focused on the gates and the park, and the whole machine was bent toward the disaster outside. Nobody was thinking about a guard off duty, slipping quietly back through a side door in his civilian coat. He went up through the back of the building. Service stairs. Dark. He told me his own breathing sounded like a drum to him, that's how quiet it was. The blast had emptied the place. The corridors were dim and still, that awful stillness a building has after something terrible has happened in the world outside it. And he came at last to the corridor with the door. He'd never been on that corridor in his life. He'd only ever seen the window from outside, the covered one, the one with the light that came and went at 3 in the morning. Now he stood in front of the door itself for the first time. It was an ordinary door. That was the thing that got him, he said. After a year of it being this great dark thing in his mind, it was just a door. Wood, painted white, a bit chipped at the bottom, and a brass lock, newer than the door, screwed on hard. And a chair. There was a chair set against the wall beside the door, facing it. The way a chair sits when someone has been sitting in it, for hours, for days, keeping watch. There was a cold cup of tea on the floor beside the chair and a folded newspaper. Someone had been guarding that door from the outside. Sitting in that chair day and night, making sure nobody went in, and he understood with a cold drop in his stomach, making sure nobody came out. He tried the handle, locked of course. He could have given up there. A locked door, a brass lock, no key. He told me he stood there for a moment, and the sensible part of his brain told him to go, to wait, to let the police do it tomorrow, to not be a fool. And then he remembered the crying. The quiet, tired crying he'd heard come down on the wind one night, and told himself he'd imagined. He didn't imagine it, he said. He'd known all along he hadn't. So he didn't give up. He was a strong young man, and it was a cheap lock screwed into old wood, and he put his shoulder to it the way they teach you, low and hard, once, twice. And on the third the wood around the lock split and gave, and the door swung in, and Daniel stood in the doorway of the room behind the locked door at last. He told me about the room slowly. It was hard for him. I'll give it to you the way it cost him to give it to me. It wasn't a cell. That's what people expect when I tell this, and it's important it wasn't, because what it was worse in a quieter way. It was a nice room. A sitting room, a study, the one the cook had told me about years before, where Charlotte used to sit and read in the window. Nice furniture, a good chair, shelves of books. But the window was covered, boarded, near enough, a board fitted over it on the inside, screwed to the frame, so that no light got in and no one got out, and no one outside could see anything but the faint leak of lamplight around the edges at 3 in the morning. The room that used to look out over the gardens now looked out at nothing. A nice room with its eyes put out. And it had been lived in for a long time. You could see a year of a life in it, books read and reread. A blanket worn thin, and on the desk. On the desk, he said, was the thing that finished him. Letters, stacks of them. Charlotte's handwriting, he found out later, page after page after page. Letters to people outside, to friends, to family, to anyone. Please come. Please ask after me. I am not ill. I am not resting. He is not letting me leave this room. Please don't believe what he tells you. Please. Folded, sealed, some of them, addressed. Never sent. Every letter she'd written for a year, asking for help, had been collected by the man in the chair outside the door and brought down and handed to Ashford, and never sent. She'd been writing into a void, filling the silence of that boarded room with cries for help that went straight into a leather case and were carried out past the guards every morning by a man with his chin up. Daniel stood in that room and read 3 of those letters, and then he couldn't read any more. That, he told me, was the moment. Not the bomb, not the crush at the gate. That was the moment the fury came up in him all the way, and he knew he was going to do something about it no matter what it cost him. But the room was empty. She wasn't there. Here's where the two halves of that terrible day come together, and I have to back up and tell you the other half, the half nobody knew until later, the half that turns the whole thing. Where was Charlotte? She'd got out. Not that morning, well, that morning too, but it had started long before. This is the part that, when I finally understood it, made me cry, an old man behind a flower stand. Because the truth of that kind young woman was even better than the kind young woman the cook had told me about. For months, even locked in that room, even with the boarded window and the man in the chair, Charlotte had found a way out. There was an old servant's passage off that wing, the kind of thing nobody remembers exists in those great old buildings, a narrow back stair that came out by the kitchens. The man in the chair guarded the door. Nobody guarded the passage because nobody alive remembered it was there. But Charlotte, who'd lived in that wing her whole life, who'd explored it as a child, Charlotte remembered. And so at night when the household slept and the man in the chair dozed, she'd slip out. Not to run. She could have run, I suppose, but it seems she'd worked out clever girl, clever, frightened, brave girl, that if she simply vanished, Ashford would have a clean story. She's run off. She's unwell. She's gone abroad to rest. He'd have controlled the story completely and she'd have had nothing. So instead she did something stranger and braver. She slipped out, and she went and did the only thing that had ever made her feel like herself. She went and helped people. There was a shelter, a night place near the bottom of the park for people with nowhere to go, soup, a warm room, a bed if there was one. And a young woman had been turning up there on and off for months. Quiet. Plain coat, no fuss, never gave her real name, washed dishes, sat with people, listened. The folk who ran the place thought she was a volunteer who didn't like to talk about herself, and they were glad of her because she was good at it, good at the listening, good at remembering people's names, good at the real kind of kindness, the kind that costs you something. They never knew. Not one of them knew, for months, that the quiet girl washing their dishes was a princess who was risking everything, sneaking out of a boarded room past a sleeping guard, to be there. And on the morning of the bomb, the worst morning, 8 minutes to 10, she was there, at the shelter, by the bottom of the park, because she'd slipped out before dawn and hadn't gone back yet. She was perhaps 200 yards from where it went off. I'll tell you what she did, because Daniel found out and told me, and because she deserves to have it said. When the blast came, the shelter shook and the windows blew in and there was screaming inside and out. And the quiet volunteer girl who never gave her name, she didn't freeze and she didn't run. She did the same thing Daniel did at the gate, 200 yards away, without either of them ever knowing the other was doing it. She got people calm. She got the ones inside down low and away from the glass. She tore up cloth and pressed it to wounds. She went out into the dust, out into it, toward it, and she pulled a man who couldn't walk back toward the shelter doorway and went back and brought another. The folk who ran the place said afterward they didn't know where she found it. This quiet girl who never said much, suddenly hard and certain and absolutely unafraid, in the middle of the worst thing any of them had ever seen. She stayed until the ambulances had it in hand. She stayed for hours, and then, dusk gray from head to foot, hands cut, exhausted, she slipped away, the way she always did before anyone could ask her name. And she went back to the palace. Not back to the room. She couldn't, the wing was sealed by then, police everywhere. But back to the building by the old passage into the kitchens, and there she was found at last, long after dark, sitting on a kitchen stool, gray with the same dust that gray-coated Daniel, too tired and too far past fear to hide anymore. That's where the household found their missing princess. Not run away, not unwell, not abroad resting, sitting in her own kitchen covered in the dust of a bomb she'd run toward, having spent the worst morning of London's year pulling strangers out of the smoke with her bare hands. So now you have it, both halves. The girl in the kitchen and the guard in the corridor, both of them gray with the same dust, neither knowing yet about the other. Daniel didn't know she was safe when he broke that door. He thought, standing in that boarded room reading those unsent letters, that he might be too late, that she might have been out by the park when it went off, that she might be among the people he'd watched stream past his post that morning, bleeding. He came out of that room with the letters in his hand and the fury full up in him, and he went looking, and he came down a back stair into the kitchens, and there she was, alive, filthy, looking up at a dust-gray guardsman she'd never met, holding a stack of her own letters that she'd thought were lost forever. He told me they didn't say much. He said he just held the letters up so she could see he had them, see that someone finally had them, that someone finally knew. And he said she put her hand over her mouth and made a sound he'd never forget, a sound like a year of being disbelieved breaking all at once. And then she said the first thing she'd said to him. She said, "Is everyone all right? At the gate, the crowd, I heard there was a crush. Did everyone?" That's what she asked. First thing. Covered in the dust of a bomb, holding proof she'd been a prisoner for a year, and her first question was whether the strangers at the gate were all right. Daniel said that was the moment he understood exactly what kind of person had been locked behind that door, and exactly what kind of man had locked her there. Now the fury. I promised you the fury, and you've been patient, so here it is. It didn't come out as a brawl. I think part of people wants Daniel to have caught Ashford by the throat. But Daniel was smarter than that, and angrier than that, the cold, smart kind of angry that does the worst possible thing to a man like Ashford. It beats him properly in the open, where he can't lie his way out. What Daniel did was, he made sure the truth got out faster than Ashford could bury it. The leather case. Remember the case clutched to Ashford's chest, the thing he ran from the bomb to protect? Daniel had been right about it. It wasn't documents for work. It was the evidence. A year of it. The intercepted letters he hadn't yet destroyed. The records of how Charlotte's money, and there was money, she was a royal money she should have controlled, had been quietly moved, signed away, with a signature that wasn't quite hers. Ashford had been controlling her, robbing her, and keeping her boarded up in that room so that no one would ever hear her say so. The advisor. The man who walked through the gates with his chin up. And he'd run from a bomb to save the proof of it, because to a man like that, the proof of his crime was more precious than the lives in the street. It came apart fast once it started. Charlotte was alive and free and talking, with a guardsman as a witness and a stack of her own unsent letters in her own hand. The police already had the wing sealed for the bomb. Now they had a great deal more to look at. The man in the chair outside the door talked, to save himself. The shelter folk, once they understood who their quiet volunteer had been, talked too, and what they said about her ran exactly opposite to everything Ashford had told the world. Ashford was finished. I won't go into all of it, courts, the law, things that took years and that I only half followed. But finished. The chin-up man who'd made me feel small with a single look spent the rest of his days as small as a man can be made. He never walked through those gates again. And Daniel. This is the part that still gets me, even now telling it to you, an old man who's outlived his own flower stand. You'd think he'd have been a hero. You'd think there'd have been medals and headlines, the brave guard who held his post through the bomb, who steadied the crowd, who broke the door and freed the princess and brought down the wicked man. There was almost none of that. The bomb itself, yes, there was a bit in the papers about the guards who held their posts, and his name was in it once, small among others. But the rest of it, the door, the letters, the truth about Charlotte, that was kept quiet. Families like that keep things quiet. They were grateful to him in their way. He wasn't punished for breaking his post or breaking that door, which under the rules he certainly could have been. But they didn't put him on a stage either. It wasn't that kind of story for them. It was an embarrassment that he'd helped end, and you don't throw a parade for the man who reminds you of your embarrassment. He didn't seem to mind. I asked him once on one of our walks, didn't it gall him that he'd done all that and nobody knew? He thought about it, the long way like always. Then he said, she knows. That was all, she knows. And he gave me a small, tired smile, and we kept walking toward the tube. He left the guard not long after, said he'd done the thing he was there to do and it was time. He went back up north to his mum, married the girl from the bakery. I got a card every Christmas for years. Then the cards stopped the way they do, and I lost the thread of him, the way you lose the thread of people, and I never found it again. I don't know if he's still alive. I hope he is. I'd like to think of him old now like me, sitting somewhere warm, knowing what he did. And Charlotte, well, you won't find her in this story by her real name, and I won't give it to you because she got her quiet back at last and she's earned the keeping of it. But I'll tell you this, she got free. She got her life back, her money back, her name back. And the kind of kindness she'd been sneaking out of a boarded room to give, she got to give it in the open after that for the rest of her life. The real kind. The kind that costs you something. I like to think she still remembers a dusty guardsman holding up a stack of her letters in a kitchen at the end of the worst day. So she'd know someone had finally heard her. I think she does. She knows. I told you at the start that I'm telling this now because I'm old, and because the man it's about deserves to have somebody say his name out loud one more time. I can't give you his real name. I promised. But I can tell you the thing he said to me, years before any of it, when I asked him why he did it, why the army, why the red coat, why stand still in the rain for people who'll never know yours. He said, somebody has to keep watch. Might as well be somebody who actually cares whether the people inside are safe. I thought it was just a nice thing for a young man to say. I know better now. Because everyone watched the gate that day. Everyone watched the brave guard who didn't run. But Daniel was watching something nobody else thought to watch, a covered window, a tray that came back full, a light that burned at 3 in the morning. He kept watch on the thing no one else was keeping watch on, the thing already inside. That's the difference between a man standing still and a man on guard. Anybody can stand still. It takes a rare soul to actually be watching.